humans are Homo sapiens, right? What does that mean? It means the creature that seeks to know. I mean, it's what we are. Like it just, there is no utility. It's a fulfillment of our reality that human beings seek to know.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I have the delight of speaking with Pano Kanelos, the founding president of the University of Austin. The University of Austin was announced as a new project almost exactly 2 years ago, and it has been the subject of much controversy and much attention. But the simple version of the story is that the University of Austin is the first new university to be launched in the state of Texas in 60 years. And they are undertaking the great mission of rethinking what a university ought to be inside the context of the 21st century, but also inside the contextual history of education at large and how we have historically educated our children inside of the university system and what we might be getting right, but also what we might be getting wrong and what we might be able to do better. For those of you who have followed the show for a while or who have followed my own work, you might know that I myself did not go to college. I opted out to go work in the startup world instead. But had I gone to school, my top choice would have been St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. And prior to coming on board the founding team of the University of Austin, Pano was the president of St. John's College. And so he and I had a lengthy conversation about the importance of the great books and reading the classics and studying the history of the deep, fundamental, existential human questions as preparation for engaging with the world as an adult. We also talked extensively about whether or not the college system actually has a monopoly on people's ability to prepare themselves for the real world, or even on people's ability to learn and transfer information. We talk about the definition of human flourishing and how one should think about that inside the context of designing an education, either for themselves or for their children. And we talk about the development of the University of Austin and how Pano and the founding team are thinking about what they want to keep from the long tradition of the university system and what they want to innovate on and what they want to do differently and how they want to think as much as possible from first principles about what the ideal experience is for a young adult from ages 18 to 22 to prepare them not only for a lifetime of learning, but also for a lifetime of flourishing within the adult world. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking with Pano. He is an absolute delight to talk to, and I really hope you enjoy this episode. If you enjoy listening to this episode, or if you have enjoyed listening to previous episodes, please take a few moments to do me a favor and leave a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple. Reviews help the show grow and help it reach new audiences and help me land more guests. So if you don't mind, please take a moment, hit the 5-star button. And if you are listening on YouTube, please like and subscribe to the channel to make sure that you don't miss future episodes. Thank you and enjoy the show. Pano, welcome to the podcast.
It's really, really great to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
I feel like this is a show that was years in the making. And I feel like this is a thing that was inevitably going to happen at some point in time. You don't know this, but or maybe I told you this when we first met. I don't remember. But I grew up homeschooled and I did not go to college because I was in many ways getting a college level. I was being exposed at least to college level resources when I was in high school. The status quo path just didn't feel like it made sense to me. But there were a couple of schools that I very seriously considered. And the top of the list was St. John's College.
All right.
I almost went to St. John's, and a couple of my friends that I grew up homeschooled with did go to St. John's, and I know that you worked with them. And so I feel like that was a near miss years ago where in a slightly different version of reality, I would have had the chance to work with you at St. John's, which would have been amazing.
Yeah.
But
It's
I've
funny. I hear that from a great many people who,
really,
not necessarily they didn't go to college, but sort of, especially when I was at St. John's, wish they had gone to St. John's. I mean, it was an extraordinary. There's kind of, it's such a distinctive education.
Mhm.
And I didn't go there as an undergraduate. I mean, I don't know if I was smart enough to get in. The only way for me to get in was to go there as president. And that was the only way. And I couldn't even teach there. I wasn't that smart. But I would hear from so many people, like later in life, after 10 years after I went to college, I learned about this place called St. John's, and I wish I had gone there, and et cetera, et cetera. And so it's a common refrain.
Is it primarily people who didn't know about it when they were choosing an undergrad? Because it's a really
Yeah.
small school. So it
Yeah,
seems
it's
like it
tiny.
surprises me that there are a lot of people who wish they had gone.
Yeah. Yeah, mostly people who learned about it after the fact, or some people who knew about it, but for one reason or another, it's a strong choice, right?
Mhm.
It's a college without any specific majors. Everybody follows the same course of study. You're reading 200 great books, and so sometimes I think some young people who are on the verge of choosing a college are looking at St. John's and they just don't. Can't quite get to making that choice. But then later on, they look back and like, I should have done it. So
Yeah, that was part of my rationale was I was already very accustomed to being on a very non-traditional path. Like being homeschooled just inoculates you
yeah,
against the perceived weirdness of society at large, thinking that you're doing something odd and different. But I was reading the great books in high school, and I wasn't getting nearly the level of discussion, not even close, that I would have gotten at St. John's, and that's what I wanted. But I didn't want to do anything in particular that required a degree. I didn't know at the time what I wanted to do, but I knew I had very entrepreneurial proclivities.
yeah.
And so the course of study, like, it just didn't make sense for the path that I was on. But on a very deep soul level, it would have made me very happy. But I've always been so enamored by what St. John's is, because when I was in high school, my parents gave me I was very academic. So my parents kind of gave me free reign, and I was allowed to just go study whatever I wanted as long as I was meeting the state requirements to be what I was supposed to be doing in high school. And a lot of what I gravitated towards was classical studies and the great books, because to me, it just felt like the pinnacle of what an education ought to be. And so I'd love to talk about this with you a little bit.
Sure.
Because I, on an intuitive level, understand the value of the great books, but I'd love to hear what your case for it is.
Absolutely. I mean, and I will say that this is something I had to come to learn myself. I mean, I had a relatively conventional college experience myself.
Where did you go to school?
I went to Northwestern University, and I came to college radically underprepared to go to a university because I was a first generation college student. And my parents, had never been to university. Came from a Greek immigrant background, and so I didn't know how to choose a college. Really spend much time thinking about it, to be honest. I didn't know. I just sort of fell into it, and I didn't know what to do when I was there. So for me, the undergraduate experience was really underwhelming. I mean, this is at Northwestern. It was, a good school, but I was a kid who, like you, I just loved to read books and I just loved ideas. And I was just taking classes to check boxes. And, I had to pick a major. So I picked a major. It was English. And I just sort of did this. And it didn't seem to add up to very much in the end. And there wasn't a through line. There wasn't any sense of cohesiveness. So I actually, after my undergraduate years, I actually started to intuitively pursue what you would call a great books education on my own, which led me to go to graduate programs that were, I did a master's at a program called the University Professors at Boston University, which was really interdisciplinary and, bookish. And then I went to the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, which is sort of like a graduate level St. John's in some ways. So I just sort of stumbled into that. And that, as I went into the academy as a professor, I kept getting categorized. Like, you have to be a professor of English, or be a professor of theater. And I wanted something more. And so I started teaching in these kind of great books honors programs, and I loved it. And And then I went on to be a dean at a place called Valparaiso University, had a great books honors college. And the next thing you know, for some mysterious reason, the St. John's College hired me as president. I'm still not quite sure how to process that, but I was so radically unqualified to be president. I mean, I had no administrative experience other than I'd been a dean for 4 years before that, nothing. And then I got there and pulled some like Jedi mind trick on the people interviewing me, and they offered me this job. But it was a passion. I mean, at that point, I really understood the value of classical education, great books education, because what I realized I had been looking for the whole time was not great books, but the great conversation, the way that books spoke to books over time. And that's the through line, right? That no book is an island. Every book comes from a place of encounter with a legacy, and every book establishes itself as part of a greater legacy. At least great books do that. And so what I've been looking for was that. I was looking for, what's the genealogy of ideas and who we are and where does this come from? So getting to St. John's, where that is really the kind of soul of the institution, for those who aren't familiar with St. John's, it's basically a 4-year college education where you begin in the ancient world and you read roughly 200 books in chronological order and make your way to the modern world across, philosophy and literature and mathematics and sciences, especially the natural sciences, and you just every class is just a book and a conversation. There aren't lectures, there isn't even really context. And I thought, that was really extraordinary. And so I think, you asked me what the values. I'm sorry, I'm going on a long time, but
no, this is great.
What's the value of this? Look, every human being is a creature of logos. Right? We live in and through language. I mean, every moment of our waking lives, there are words going through our head. Mm-hmm. It's kind of constantly spooling through our head. We have a kind of internal conversation. And the way we become part of the human race is by externalizing our conversation, by talking to others, right? And so our lives are essentially, our humanity itself is the exchange of language, of ideas. If logos is what we're imbued with, when we speak to others, it's dialogue, which just means two creatures, logos sharing ideas. And so what makes books great is that they're carrying on the conversation that we all should be having. And so we get to jump into that and be a part of it. And they elevate us in that process. And so for me, it's not about studying books. It's about encountering those who have come before us and who have like spliced themselves open in a way that is continuously compelling and always worthy of returning to.
The way you phrased the ongoing conversation was the thing that captivated me about the great books too. I was 14 or 15 when I read I'd read the American classics and the classics in a novel sense. But my first like true ancient classic was Oedipus Rex. And I was 14 or 15 and I was learning about ancient Greece, and my mom got the book out of the library and she said, I really think you would like this. I think you should read it. I'd never been exposed to the old classics before. I had no idea. And I sat down, I read the whole thing cover to cover, and I came up with my mouth wide open and my eyes wide open. Like, I didn't know these things existed. And this is so fascinating. I went deep down the rabbit hole really fast. And I wanted to know, like, where did these books come from? And I didn't really have a lot of context for it. And pretty quickly, I discovered somebody describing very similarly to what you just said, that the classics are an ongoing conversation. The canon is a conversation, is all these thinkers separated by time, but speaking across time and place, engaging with each other about what is the nature of reality, what is the nature of the human spirit, what are the answers to the deep human questions that we all grapple with. And that just captivated me. I was like, I can't think of anything better to spend my time on. But for me, it was very intuitive. It was just, I'm a words person. I'm a story person. So I very naturally find this very compelling. But I think when people talk about education, there's a big part of the conversation comes back to practicality. Like one of the big criticisms that a lot of people have about the education that the average American gets is that there's a big delta between what they need to know in order to be successful at life and what they're learning by checking all the boxes and jumping through the kind of generic hoops. And I think people often throw out the baby with the bathwater with that. They're like, well, kids need to learn practical skills. So why would they spend all their time reading classics? And there's a compelling argument to be made in response to that. And I'd love to hear your take on it, because like, why should the average person who just wants to be successful at life, what is the utility of reading the great books?
Well, first of all, when people say there's sort of things that we need to know to be successful, I'd love to know what those things are. Like, what do they actually mean? Like,
well, it's a broad spectrum. I ask this question on Twitter a lot because I want to get a pulse on what the answers are. And it's everything from I need to learn how to pay my taxes to like I should be learning sales and marketing skills because that's what I'm actually going to use on the job. It's a pretty broad array. Everyone has a different answer.
Like, I think anything you can learn on YouTube is like, just shelve that until you need to learn how to do it. Right. And I would say that a true education are the things you can't learn on YouTube. Right. It's that it is kind of the deep dive into that human experience, which is, mysterious and inchoate and beautiful and terrifying. And, I don't think learning how to do accounting is terrifying and mysterious. It's just sort of manual in a way. And there are a lot of things in life we have to do. I'm going to drive a car and flip an egg and all that. That's great. That's not education. I mean, that's just maneuvering life. So if there's something real about education, and if real education is happening, it's not about our kind of manual material existence. It's about our kind of internal, our internal, what's called spiritual existence, I think. I mean, just think about this for a moment. You mentioned Oedipus Rex. We are so distracted by the wrong things today. I mean, we live in a world where people are like, well, if we don't look the same as each other, there's like an impenetrable barrier between our experiences. Like we're just, we're so different that, and then like, but here you are as a teenager reading Oedipus Rex, which was written 2,500 years ago by somebody in a culture that couldn't be more different than the world that you're living in. I mean, there's no electricity and lifespans are, half of what they are today. And, and you're not exactly sure what like that big orb in the sky is and where it goes and all that. And yet they tell a story and it's completely comprehensible, and not only comprehensible, but emotionally resonant. So, I mean, to me, that's an education to learn that humanity has that, that the experience of humanity is so consistent over time. Like that's an education, just that insight there, not flipping the egg.
I'm going to take this one level deeper just because I think really getting to the root of this is going to be very important for the conversation that we are going to have that follows. Why? What is the utility of that? Why is that is it merely that it enhances the experience of being a human to understand this? Or are there fundamental reasons why this is necessary for being able to live a good life, which I know that in and of itself is, a very broad, like that in and of itself requires definition, but I'd love to hear you go deeper on this still.
So humans are Homo sapiens, right? What does that mean? It means the creature that seeks to know. I mean, it's what we are. Like it just, there is no utility. It's a fulfillment of our reality that human beings seek to know. And so when it's like the proverbial fish that has to keep swimming in order not to die, we have to keep learning and seeking knowledge to continue to be human. I mean, if you stop at any point, your humanness kind of shrivels up.
It's like you're growing or dying
expression. right? So there's no utility. I mean, it's existential, and again, this is why looking at, books written 2,500 years ago, where, I mean, what is the whole point of Oedipus? Oedipus seeks to know his true identity. I mean, he gets bad news when he learns what it is, but he's so compelled to seek out who he really is, that it's actually worth the tragic conclusion. I mean, I think if you look at what happens at the end of Oedipus, it's horrific and traumatic, but at the same time, I think we all would say it's probably better that he knows the truth than not as a human being. So, I mean, in many ways, Oedipus is the kind of poster child for the compulsion that we have to learn about who we are, and the tragic nature that as we find out the truth about who we are, it's not all strawberries and chocolates.
Yeah, I find it is highly poetic that was the thing that set the fire for me.
Yeah.
And it's a phenomenal introduction because it's very accessible. It's fun to read. It's a very engaging story. But it also it lights that fire. If someone 2,500 years ago can write something this compelling, what else is out there? Like, there's the obvious, well, I'm going to go read Antigone next, and I'm going to find out what else, Sophocles was up to. But it's just this ever cascading avalanche of ideas and stories and inquiries that one can delve into. You mentioned the YouTube distinction, which I think is I like this. But I want to play devil's advocate for just a second, because I think there's a little bit of nuance here. So you can listen to lectures about the great books on YouTube. My introduction to them, so I presume you're familiar with the great courses.
Oh, sure.
And there's a similar company called Modern Scholar. I used both of them extensively in high school as like kind of the baseline for what I was building my different classes around. And one of my primary introductions to the great books, Modern Scholar, has this amazing, I think it's a 6-volume series called Odyssey of the West that's put together by Timothy Schutt from Kenyon College. And he brought in different professors with different areas of expertise throughout history. And it was just a 6-volume exploration of the Western canon. Yeah. And I loved it so much.
Okay. Point well taken.
But no, I mean, I think that there's just like a definitional level of nuance here. It's like you can get into like there's access, and it's less arguing with you, and it's more I'm sort of giving a teaser to where we're going in this conversation around like, well, what's the utility of the school and the university, and like versus what you can do on your own. There is this like weird nebulous, we live in a world that we, like, as humans, we haven't ever had before, where you have access to information everywhere, and you can delve into all of these things, and most of us are using it very poorly. We're learning, I say we collectively, I do not actually lump myself into this category, but like we're learning TikTok dances with our phones instead of going to Project Gutenberg and reading some John Locke or whatever you find interesting that day. But we have this entire conversation at our fingertips. But there is a distinction, like on an intuitive level, between the stuff that you can just Google, like how to change a tire. It's probably helpful to have tried that before you're trying to do it in the rain in the middle of the night. But, like you can look it up and find the instructions in a pretty straightforward way. But there's more nuance to this being a human stuff that you're talking about that's harder to just Google and find answers to. I know this isn't like a very specific question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the distinction between these two different categories of inquiry, because the intuition, I think, is very correct that they're different, but it's maybe hard to put a finger on.
Yeah. So I used YouTube as sort of shorthand,
but it works because there's an intuition that it's naming.
Yeah. I mean, it's a medium, right? And so, obviously, like any medium, it depends upon what it is transmitting. That's important. And I actually love the great books, great courses, and that, and those sorts of things as well. So, I think that maybe here's a difference. All right, something that's like an instructional video or instructional manual that is there to give you a ready-made answer. right?
No one's intellectually grappling with the tire changing video.
There to give you a ready-made answer.
Yeah.
I need to know how to do this, and here's how you do it. Something that is, let's say, educational in its root sense is there to pose a question for you. And so I think that's the difference.
And I think that's very elegantly put. And I think for the individual trying to figure out how to grapple with this, I think that distinction is very important because, we're talking about this in the context of, we started the conversation in the context of St. John's College, but this is something that transcends even the traditional phase of life where one is in education or one is learning. There's sort of this weird dichotomy where there's like before graduation and after graduation, and how we engage with learning are very different. And I find that highly problematic for like that does not equate to me to the ways of thinking about learning that are necessary for living a very fulfilling life. But when we think about it in those terms, this is something that still transcends. Like you want to be, even after you have graduated, you want to be like, to your point of like, this is existential. You want to be grappling with these questions always. You want to be thinking about these things, reading these books. So it's more, I think it's an important fundamental distinction even for somebody who's in the middle of their life and is trying to figure out how do I engage with these ideas in a meaningful way for me? Like there is, we kind of know deep down, but it's not something that I think on a cultural level we do a very good job putting our finger on. Like it's very weird to me that this is such a like, eccentric isn't quite the right word, but it kind of gets at what I mean. Like you're unusual if you spend a lot of time reading the great books. It's not a thing that necessarily the average person you meet on the street is doing.
Well, I mean, I think that's empirically true. Why that's the case is an interesting question. Part of it, I think, is what you touched on earlier, is we live in a culture of overstimulation. Right? There's just so much stuff out there all the time. And enough of it is minimally attractive enough to distract you.
Yes.
So that, it's kind of, you can find yourself in a kind of, internet search rabbit hole very easily, kind of hyperlinking from something not very important to something.
Which is even like a
important.
Self-soothing stupor where it's like, if I just keep getting these like little dopamine hits, my brain can like in the background take a break from
exactly right.
assessing all of this information.
Yeah. And it's just, there's that, I mean, there's that kind of like constant drip, drip, drip of, it's not exactly pleasure, but it's mild stimulation, right? So we live in a world where we're stimulated enough to be distracted most of the time. And to move to reading a book or, seeing a play or watching a real film that is actually going to take some intellectual wrestling to sort of like, take some effort, some exercise to spend time with, it's hard to get on the treadmill, right? It's hard to sort of get up and say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to spend my time doing this, even though it's hard. It's good for me. I got to get out. I got to put the chips down. I got to get on the treadmill. It's the same thing about reading a book that's going to pose intellectual challenge or let's say mental tension or resistance. Which,
to carry that metaphor to its conclusion, once you've built the habit of expecting the dopamine of getting on the treadmill, then you crave it. Like it is not an infinitely steep hill. It is a steep buy-in to the way of being. But there have been, and I'm sure you know infinitely more about this than I do, but there have been ebbs and flows throughout history where it has been more of a cultural value to engage with these things and times when it hasn't been as much. And this is, again, kind of an open-ended question, but I'm very curious how you think about like where this importance of the classics and a liberal arts education fits in the broader cultural milieu of the world that we're currently living in, and maybe how we got here, and if not how we got here, then perhaps like where you want to see it going, or where you think it, because you mentioned existentialism earlier, perhaps even where you think we need to be going in order to be okay?
Well, I think in reality, throughout all of human history, it has always been that somebody who has had the impulse and or opportunity to read books, any books, let alone read books extensively. I think that's always been rare. Like throughout most of human history, it's a very small number of people who have been able to engage directly with the great conversation. The difference is this: throughout most of human history, that's because most human beings didn't have the opportunity to do that. There was butter to be churned, and pails of water to be filled, and it was a luxury beyond the reach of most people to read anything but, in some cases, the Bible that you'd have in your home, and that. So the difference today in the culture is we, at least the people who live in the advanced in industrial West and in some other parts of the world, it's not a luxury anymore. I mean, we could as we're saying, but we could read anything we want. Everything is accessible, and our time is so flexible. And so there's a kind of what before was sort of tragic because it was inaccessible. It's now we have something that's tragic because it's so accessible, yet we choose not to do these things, to do the things that are edifying for us. And so, I would, you ask me what I would like to see happen. It would just be great if we could infuse, first of all, the educational experience of especially young people with enough of the experience of coming to understand, like you did at an early age, that there is something deeply pleasurable, deeply humanly satisfying about reading and thinking and discussing and encountering art, that this is actually that this is actually something that you can come to not only appreciate, but come to crave. If we could build this into the culture in a way so that we can create those habits early on, we would be in a much better place. And also if we had a culture where, again, this was something that was not considered to be, I think part of the problem is thinking of these experiences of reading the great books, whatever it is, as educational. I think that's part of the problem, right? Because education is something, again, you asked what the utility of it is, and that it just should be habitual. It should just be who we are and what we do. And I don't want to get on a high horse. I mean, if believe me, I don't spend all my time like making my way through, Shakespearean sonnets and, Dostoevsky and all that. I mean, we all live lives that are multidimensional. But enough of this kind of stuff in one's life, I think, enriches the whole.
Yeah, and I think that education point that you made is really important, because this is something that I come up against. Like, I grapple with this a lot, the languaging thing around how we think about where the things traditionally classified as education actually fall in the panorama of the experience of being a human. I run a media brand called Rebel Educator. It's right there in the word education is right there in the title of what I do. And yet I struggle with this a lot, because I think we think of education as, it's a bit frumpy sometimes. It's like, well, it's not a cool thing to be doing. Like, I want to be doing something cool, like, and entertaining, like watching a movie or watching a sporting event or something. It's like, and it feels like effort. There's an implication of, oh, this is education, therefore it's going to be work. And I think both of those things for a lot of people are very subconscious biases that they hold when they hear about something being educational. They're like, well, that's going to require effort.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure if I have two YouTube videos in front of me. This is not intended to be a callback to your previous metaphor. This is a different one. I have two YouTube videos in front of me, and one of them is, I don't know, something that's purely entertaining and the other one is in my mind labeled as education, I'm going to pick the entertaining one because it feels like less work, even though the educational one might be wildly entertaining. But I think there's this weird split between education and entertainment that reading at a perspective was fun. It was, I couldn't put the book down. I couldn't tear myself away from it. I was completely captivated by it. A lot of the classics are really fun. There's a little bit of buy-in where you have to like, internalize the language and become used to the intellectual lift that is like maybe a slightly archaic version of the language or a different type of vocabulary than you're used to. So it's a little different from the things that you're normally reading. And there's a slight acclimation period. But after you get through that, it's fun. But people don't think about it that way. They think of it, it's like eating their vegetables. It's like, well, it's for my own good. So I'm going to do it because I have to. It's like going to the gym because I want to be fit. But I don't actually like the process of going to the gym. And I think I think we miss some things there with thinking about education as this like own category as opposed to just like part of the habit of being a human, to your point.
That's right. Heidegger's not fun. I mean, there are a lot of things you read that are fun.
There's a lot that's not fun.
It's still, it's,
But you can get through a lot to approaching it as fun.
Well, and
conceded.
And I would say that there's still intellectual gratification through working through things that are very difficult. It's a pleasure and it's in a different sort of sense.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think, I think part of the reason that we have developed a culture that is so intellectually sclerotic is because we have cordoned off a portion of our life dedicated to this thing called education. There's X number of years and there's these particular signifiers of like accomplishment and boxes to be checked and, certifications that you get along the way. And so everything in this kind of system lends itself to wanting to get it done and get it out of the way. Mm-hmm. So whatever you associate with this, learning mathematics or, figuring out, how to scan a poem or whatever it is, it's just all part of this kind of systematic sort of building blocks of things that lead up to a kind of, again, a kind of certification in that. Mm-hmm. So by contextualizing things that way, I think that it takes whatever kind of innate pleasure there is in such things and it minimizes them. It can't kill it entirely. But it minimizes them and then you're done. Instead of encouraging somebody, instead of inspiring them to want more, it kind of inspires a kind of the opposite, a kind of like, let's just get this completed and move on sort of attitude. So I guess I'm not doing very well, supporting the case for a new university.
Well, we'll get to that. We'll get to that in a minute.
I'm like, did I just talk myself out of a job? Education is like, we shouldn't be doing this thing called education. It's kind of crazy. But,
well, I think that I see all of this as a prerequisite or like a buy-in to the conversation that we're going to have about building a new university. But I actually think that this point that you bring up is really interesting. And this is something I talk about this from varying angles on the show all of the time, because like what we do here is, sometimes we just talk about random things that I find interesting, like the genetics of redheads, but usually we talk about things that are related to education. And it's maybe inobvious that as many of these threads as I go down are like how they're all intersected, but they definitely are all getting at the same thing. And one of the big questions is this that you just posed, what are the ways that in which we think about education that are correct, and what are the ways in which we think about education that perhaps could use some updating, some innovating? Like there are pieces of this that I think are correct and true, and there are pieces of this that we've just are sort of grandfathered in, and we've been doing them for a long time, and we haven't necessarily stopped and said, well, wait a second, what is the? And there is this weird split between like part of the reason that we educate people when they're young, and I would love to hear you push back on this if you disagree, because I know you have a lot of philosophical thoughts on this, but if you can forgive my simplification of it, part of the reason that we educate people when they're young is because we are preparing them for the rest of life that follows. So, we educate our kids before we put them in the productive part of society as preparation. There is a component of that. But as we talked about earlier, the lines start to get very blurry between, well, what is, a practical thing that a kid actually needs to know before they go out into the real world, and what if that is a school's responsibility to teach versus what is like sort of training their mind to be a thinker versus what is exposing them to these different avenues of thought that maybe have nothing to do with what they will end up doing for the rest of their lives. But there is it's not directly utilitarian, but it is shaping their capacity to think as a human, and that is important. And then on the other side, we think of it as, like you said, this checklist. It's just we have to just check all the things off the list, and when you get to a critical mass of things checked off, you can graduate, and then you don't have to do this anymore. Education as a phase versus a way of being. And then this other side of like, well, are we training lifelong learners, which a lot of people pay lip service to, but aren't necessarily, there's not exactly a correlation between what we're doing and that being the outcome. But I do think it's worth delving into. And I know you spend a lot of time thinking about this. We'll talk about the new university in a little bit, but like you spend a lot of time thinking about what education ought to be. I'd like to hear some of your takes, maybe even some of your spicy takes, if you have them on what,
I don't know if I'm spicy, but
on what do you think are some of the biggest things that we do get right traditionally that we should hold on to, and maybe some of the things that, generally speaking, we seem to be getting kind of wrong? You alluded to some of this already, but
yeah.
I'd like to go down this rabbit hole a little bit.
Yeah, so I think if we're thinking of education as a process, there are things that we need to learn that are prerequisite to learning other things. Right? So there is a process. I mean, and this is just education maps onto human growth, right? So you start off and you come into the world, and you are everything you experienced is new, and you have no way to make sense of things. And then you sort of, through the example of following your parents and family and other kids, you start to piece together the kind of the building blocks of what it means to be a person and what the world is and all that. Formal education begins, I think, when we start equipping children with the tools for learning, right? So they have to be equipped with the tool for learning, and it's very basic. And the first things they need to learn is, like, there's this thing called an alphabet. There's things called numbers, and so you start equipping them in ever more complex ways. So these things called letters are shaped into things called words, which then are shaped in things called sentences, which then become paragraphs, which then become X, Y, and Z. And so what you're doing is you're giving them the tools that are then going to allow them to learn even more. So once, at some point, you go from alphabet to reading to books. And then at that stage, you begin to access knowledge about the world that comes to you through books. And so now the point isn't just to sharpen your skills, your capacities in a kind of functional way. It's to begin to expand the range of the things that you can come to know about the world. I mean, this is one of the beauty of books, is that you can experience things you have not actually experienced directly. Okay, the human experience becomes expansively available to you. So that, and so at some point you become you become receptive to information, to knowledge, and that. And at a later stage of development, this usually starts in high school. It's not just about collecting information and broadening your perception of the world, but you begin to start asking why questions, like, why are things the way they are? And that's sort of the kind of foundational moment of critical inquiry, right? So, okay, this is interesting. Like, there are these things called wars. Why? Like, why do human beings do this when it seems, so destructive or harmful? And so you start asking the why questions. And then, that's really, I would say that sequence of events is the first phase of learning. What makes higher education is now you actually join a community that's not about receiving knowledge, but about producing knowledge. Right? What do universities do? They produce knowledge, they produce understanding. And so when you join that kind of community, you've become a different kind of learner, a different kind of knower. You become responsible for producing knowledge as opposed to responsible for receiving knowledge. That's the higher part of higher education. And yet, that's only, you've just crossed the threshold. That should be the rest of your life, right? Mm. So it's not that higher education doesn't monopolize this kind of knowledge, but, it does set a kind of standard for learning and offers an experience of learning that should predispose you to be a lifelong learner. So that was a really long answer, but this is how I see things. I mean, I see things as a kind of, a sequence of ever more complex ways of understanding the world, reaching a point where as a human being, you actually become responsible for knowledge. And to me, being a human being is to have agency, right? To have responsibility to do things, and then also responsibility to learn what things should be done. In other words, what things are better or worse, or right or wrong, and then enact on those, enact on that understanding.
Guys, this is a very big moment for the podcast. I am so excited to introduce the very first sponsor of the Hannah Frankman podcast, the John Galt Mortgage Company. My friends Mitch and Tim launched the John Galt Mortgage Company earlier this year. They'd been working in the real estate world for years, and they realized that mortgages are way more expensive than they need to be. Most people don't realize how much extra profit is baked into the cost of a mortgage. Most real estate agents don't even know. So Mitch and Tim decided to build a new kind of mortgage. They voluntarily cap their profit on every transaction. And by lowering their own commission, they pass on the savings to you in the form of lower interest rates than what everyone else is charging. For compliance reasons, I can't get into the specific dollar amounts, but I've seen some of the pricing examples, and the monthly payment can be a lot lower than with a traditional lender. And I mean a lot lower. Mitch and Tim are very good friends of mine. They believe in economic liberty, entrepreneurship, and financial independence. And they also named their company the John Galt Mortgage Company, which tells you everything you need to know about them. While I am not currently in the market for a house, when I am, I will absolutely be working with them as my mortgage broker. You can find more about them at www.johngaltmortgage.com, or you can find a link to their site down in the show notes. And if you're curious and you don't get the reference to the name, just Google who is John Galt. Okay, back to the show.
That was a beautiful answer. I love that. I want to keep going with this because you cross the threshold. You enter into higher education. Now you are part of the one discovering, you're part of the ones discovering and creating knowledge, not just receiving it. And there is, to some extent, a path that follows from there. You get your bachelor's degree, then perhaps you go on, you do research, you get a PhD. Like there is a trajectory. You perhaps become a professor yourself and you stay within the institutions and continue on this path of inquiry for the rest of your life. But it's a very small subset of the people who cross the threshold into higher education, who want to make a vocation of it within the system and within the university structure. And yet the way you're describing this, it sounds like it being a way of life for the rest of your life is not merely for those who decide to be professors. It is for, I would presume, correct me if I assume wrong, but I would presume this is like, it's a way of life for all of us. So what does that path look like?
So here's a way to think about it maybe. If the people who have the privilege, and it is a privilege, to inhabit a university as, for the rest of their life, this is their calling, their career. If these people are knowledge creators, right? When you're a university student, you are an apprentice knowledge creator, an apprenticeship in knowledge creation. And, these scholars, these professors kind of model the meta skill of knowledge creation. It doesn't matter what the subject matter is, whether it's anthropology or literature or, figuring out chemical compounds, whatever. You get to go behind the curtain and see how things are learned and how knowledge is produced. That's what you take with you when you leave a university. So university is, and this is going to sound like I mean in a utilitarian way. I don't mean this in a utilitarian way, but the purpose of the university is to prepare people for the knowledge economy. Okay. And because I use the E word, it sounds like it's about making, it's not that.
You mean like capitalism?
Capitalism. Yeah. Yes. It's, so this has always been the function of universities. So medieval universities, right? They had 3 courses of study. And you go back to the origins of Oxford, Cambridge, Sorbonne, et cetera. There were 3 courses of study. There was theology, law, and medicine. And why did you have to go to university? Because the labor to become a theologian, a doctor, or a lawyer was intellectual labor. So you had to exercise the muscle of the mind and learn things. All right. And then over time, universities came to expand to include more and more, let's say, professions that were primarily intellectual in nature, right? And so what you're really learning at a university isn't necessarily a kind of particular expertise or skill set, although it can include that. You're learning how to be a person who can take ideas and recombine them in ways that are additive to human flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, when somebody, you hire somebody who's a college graduate to do something in your company or organization, you can train them to do all the menial stuff. All the YouTube video stuff, you can train them to do yourself. What you really want them to do is bring a kind of intellectual nimbleness to your organization to interact with it in a way that's going to add value to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that to me, that's the functional purpose of higher education. If for those who are just passing through, as you said, some people just stay there for the rest of their lives, and which is mostly what I've done, and that may or may not have been a prudent thing, but it is a privilege to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. This is really interesting, and I think there are a couple different pieces of this that I want to tease out. So the first is a lot of the people who listen to this, and a lot of the people who are both listeners of the show and also follow my work with Rebel Educator, it's a broad array. Some of them are educators. Some of them they're not parents yet. I call them aspiring parents. They're like, they intend to be someday, and they want to understand how this education thing works in preparation. Some of them are just lifelong learners who are curious about this for their own purposes. But a lot of them are parents, and they're parents of kids across the entire age spectrum, because I have conversations about everything from early childhood development all the way through to higher education and beyond. But I think most of them find their way here because they are curious about what are the components that are important in an education. If it's not like just sort of the status quo, school down the street is not necessarily delivering everything that I think is true and good about what an education should be, and I want it to be something more than just the sort of like off the box of the out of the box, off the shelf in the store option. Like how do I start actually thinking about what's important here? And so I think like everything that you just walked through is extremely elucidating and helpful to that end of understanding, like, okay, what are we doing here? Because I think we often get, we lose the forest for the trees of like, well, my kid's supposed to be learning algebra this year, but they only scored a 76 on their, mid-year exams. So I don't know if they're like going to properly learn algebra. And if they don't properly learn algebra, are they going to be able to get into college? And like, are they going to be on track to get a good job? And you kind of miss out on like, well, why is this important? And what are we doing here in the first place? Like, what is the big picture? But also there's a secondary piece of this that I also think is really interesting. I'm going to play devil's advocate for just a second. and I want you to be really honest with me.
Maybe I
No, please. I didn't go to college, and I took a very non-conventional path to try to get at a lot of the same things that I thought I would have gotten in college. And I did not think you've been part of very non-conventional universities, so I don't think I'm going to offend you by saying this. I apologize if I do, but I didn't think like the status quo, just like standard, just like the average off the street university was going to be terribly beneficial to me. I thought that, I was already listening to amazing college professors with these lecture series from the great courses. I was reading tons of books. Obviously, that is not the same thing as being in a room asking questions, but somebody like Timothy Shutt, I would have been in a huge lecture hall with, like, I wouldn't have been able to sit down with him and ask him questions for hours like I wanted to anyway. If I was like, well, I love this great book series, so I'm going to go to Kenyon just so I can learn from Timothy Shutt. Lots of people do that. It's not necessarily like what the St. John's environment would have allowed, where I can sit down and actually have in-depth conversations. But I was emboldened by the fact that I'd been kind of figuring out how to piece together the education that I wanted as a homeschooler to begin with. So it's like, I'm pretty sure I can do this through college too. And like I never know what the right word is to describe what I do, because all the words have been co-opted and feel very cringy, but like I am putting my intellectual capacity to use as a core part of the work that I am doing. Like I am thinking about ideas and talking about them and grappling with them and writing about them and putting them out into the world. And that is in many ways in the spirit of what you are describing, but I had a very non-conventional path to get here. And so I think my question is kind of twofold. One is, like, literally speaking, the university as an institution does not have like a perfect monopoly on the ability to transfer knowledge. All of the things that happen inside of the walls can also happen outside of the walls. And to my knowledge, that's true for pretty much anything. Like, even if you wanted to be a doctor, it's like, well, you have to go to medical school to get licensed. But theoretically, you could apprentice with surgeons and you could be inside of hospitals and you can learn all the same stuff that you learn inside the university. The university doesn't actually have a monopoly. So if you're replicating it outside, like, what are the important things to replicate? When I say be very honest with me, like, if you think I'm missing important things in my own trajectory, please be honest with me about it, because I am always learning. But I think this is important too, to understand, like,
let me make a couple preliminary comments.
Yes.
Number one, Socrates didn't go to college.
You don't know this, I don't think, but Socrates, there's a statue of Socrates on my Twitter profile branding. I love Socrates.
Socrates did not go to college, and he was a pretty bright guy.
We saw what happened to him, though.
That's true. And number two, there is no professor you'll encounter at any university who's smarter than Tolstoy. So the entire education one needs is at one's fingertips. End stop. Okay. So, what universities are just places in the culture that we just set apart and we dedicate so that some people can have the privilege of focusing on the life of the mind intensively for 4 years or longer in graduate school or for a career. But there is no monopoly on knowledge production, even though these places are dedicated to knowledge production. So it's a highly concentrated way to get knowledge, right? I mean, in the same way you can buy those, like, what are those pills, the veggie pills, where you get like 58 vegetables in one pill, it's a highly concentrated way to get to certain things, but it's not the exclusive way to do it. And maybe it's not even better, but it might be better just to eat broccoli, instead of take the pill. So, most of the minds that I admire, I would say the vast majority of minds that I admire are not minds that were university trained. I mean, I'm a Shakespearean. Shakespeare didn't go to college, right? I had a pretty damn good, education as a young man, but, and so, I guess, your question is, what is it that what are the elements that one needs to be educated in a way that might be equivalent to that, but not that doesn't run directly through a university? I think that was sort of the question.
Yeah, and as a very small additional piece of context, I also
Yeah.
talk to a lot of people. I spend a lot of time on Twitter. Twitter attracts a lot of people who are curious about ideas and are interested in engaging with other like intellectually inclined people. And I talk to a lot of people who even went through the status quo system, but in a very utilitarian way. It was like, well, I just need to get this degree in order to get this job and whatever, and didn't feel like they got the full intellectual stimulation that they were hoping for, and are trying to figure it out on their own. I talk to lots of people who are building out Substacks and writing on the internet and finding peer groups of people to bounce their ideas off of, and are like really grappling with, I want to read more, I want to write more, I want to understand more. So this is a common phenomenon, not just for people who are opting out altogether, but also for people who took the standard path and still feel like they don't necessarily understand.
Yeah.
They didn't quite get like, but how do I do this as a way of life?
Yes. Well, and actually that was as I started, that's sort of my own experience of college, right? I found it, immensely unfulfilling.
That's why you're building a new one.
I'm building a new one, damn it. So here, maybe I can answer this question and kind of from a different angle and tell you a little bit about, I don't know if I would call it my sort of platonic ideal of a university, but I think the university that I most admire, which wasn't really a university. So one of my mentors in life was a philosopher named Roger Scruton, British philosopher. I had the privilege of studying with him when I was doing my master's program, and just brilliant man. I mean, writes about aesthetics and I mean, every aspect, phenomenology and politics and fox hunting and the Church of. I mean, he's all over, and he just really comprehensive mind. And any philosopher that can write a book titled "I Drink, Therefore I Am" is okay in my book.
I love him already.
Which was a kind of his experience of being a wine lover in life, which I am as well. So in the 80s, the 1980s, during the era of Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, Scruton became involved with what was called the underground university. That is, these were collections of intellectuals who would gather together in secret to read forbidden books. And he himself was a person who had smuggled these books into places like Czechoslovakia and Hungary and then helped convene these groups of intellectually curious people. And, they had to do all this kind of sub rosa and secretively in danger of being arrested, maybe even worse. He, to me, this was heroic. I mean, it was heroic. I mean, he himself was in danger in each of his trips of being caught by the police, being imprisoned, and that. Yet he and the people who gathered around him that create these, there were little more than, let's say, discussion groups reading books, did this in order to keep the kind of intellective flame of the human experience alive in countries where that was being snuffed out. And to me, it's the most beautiful kind of university I can imagine, right? I mean, a university where people care so much about ideas, about books, about conversation, that they're actually willing to take the greatest possible risk to continue learning, to continue discussing. It goes above and beyond anything we could ever imagine to be utilitarian, right? I mean, this is exceptionally existential. They're doing it because they need to do it the same way they need to breathe. And so for me, a university where people come together because ideas are inescapable, essential, and that, to live is to learn. That's the ultimate model for me. It's a model it's almost impossible to do in a culture like ours where it's too easy to do these things. You lose a sense of the vital importance of living a life of lively mindedness and that. So, I'm not saying that, my goal in building a university is to find, some oppressive regime that will hover over what we're doing and keep us. Although sometimes in this culture, I think we might not be that far from that. But, but for me, there's kind of a purity of intention and proven by the risk taken to pursue these things. Like, to me, that's heroic.
Do you feel like there is an element of that with the University of Austin being so explicitly, we are pro free speech, we are a safe haven for
Yeah.
professors that feel like they can't pursue this anymore? I imagine, hearing the way that you just described that story, I imagine there is sort of like a heroic narrative arc to this that you probably, and the people involved in along with you in building this, probably find quite compelling.
I mean, if I could be honest, I'd say I would love that to be true in the deepest possible sense, as it was with what Roger Scruton had done. It's somewhat true, right? I mean, the people involved with this project, we are standing up for things that we believe in. There is external pressure. There are prices that people have paid for standing up for the things that they believe and we have been collecting these people together to create an institution where there is academic freedom. But I think I'm always reminded, I mean, if I have to be completely honest, that the price to be paid is never quite the price it was for people living under the conditions there. So, I don't think we're heroic. I do think they were. I think we're right to be doing what we're doing, and I think it's necessary, but it would be too much to claim that kind of mantle of doing something at that level. But yeah, many of the people involved with our project have suffered for the things that they believe in, the ideas, and providing a haven for those who are heterodox is certainly at the kind of heart of what we're doing. It's not the only thing we're doing. But I feel like if a university is ultimately committed to the pursuit of truth, you have to be a haven for the heterodox, because the pursuit of truth involves the intersection of orthodoxy and heterodoxy. The things that we have known to be true or believed to be true, and the things that challenge those beliefs. You have to have both of those if you're actually really pursuing truth. So being welcoming to those who are coming at truth from belief systems and narratives that aren't conventional or even popular, embracing those people is especially the responsibility of a real university.
Do you think that there's an ideal balance between the orthodoxy and the heterodoxy? Like, I think that I'm young, so I don't know if this is merely a symptom of the world that I have lived in, or if this is a broader trend of human nature throughout history. I've not actively thought about this question I'm about to ask you until right this minute, so I don't know if how much of this is like based on things that I have read and observed in a broader context versus just like what I am seeing in the world around me on a day-to-day basis. But it seems to me in the world that I have engaged in that there is a very, like, people tend to gravitate towards like and have very strong feelings against that which is not like in a intellectual and values from an intellectual standpoint. Obviously people are on a surface level, like visually people are very anti, we don't gravitate towards like, we're very diverse, but in terms of ideas, there's the orthodoxy tends to all like magnetically draw together, and the heterodoxy tends to magnetically draw together. And to your point, you need both engaging with each other to some capacity in order to truly be, running the chemical reactions that lead to the discovery of truth. Do you think that there is, I'm sure you think about, you're thinking probably on a daily basis about the culture that you want to have in this university that you're building. Do you think that there is a correct split between, or like ratio of orthodoxy to heterodoxy? Like I'm getting real scientific about this, but I don't know. I don't quite know how to frame the question correctly. But how do you think about this?
I think I understand the question. I think my answer is no, I don't. I wouldn't know how to calculate that.
Well, like if maybe let me rephrase it. If you're building an organization that skews heavily heterodox, do you think that that's also like that there's a downside to that, an upside to that? How do you think about it inside of your own organization?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess it depends on what you're defining as orthodox. That's, I mean, and then,
True.
So I guess let me clarify a little bit what I mean by orthodox and heterodox. So I don't mean like our current political camps or, red versus blue or this sort of thing, or, majority versus minority beliefs. What I mean is that by orthodox, that there are inherited and legacy beliefs and ideas, many of which have a kind of general consensus around them. Mm-hmm. What I mean by heterodox are beliefs or ideas that run sideways to those, right?
Yes.
And so I don't think a person is orthodox or heterodox. I think ideas are. Mm-hmm. And what was orthodox can become heterodox and vice versa. But what I think I ultimately mean is that every responsible citizen of a university community should within them be highly attentive to both what is orthodox and what is heterodox. Right. So, let's say if we go back to the subject of, great books. By the way, I almost never use, unless I do it unintentionally, the word, the definite article. I almost never say the great books because that seems to be too shaped.
Ah.
All right. I think there are great books, and there are great books that we know and great books to be discovered. Mm-hmm. So I'd just say that. But what would be orthodox would be the great books, right? And what would be heterodox would be the great books that we're still discovering, right? So you need to be very, very attentive to both, right? And not reject something just because it is legacy in favor of what is, novel or heterodox or revolutionary. And at the same time, you can't reject something just because it's not what has been given or not what is, normative or conventional in that. So I think when I talk about the encounter between orthodoxy and heterodoxy, I'm really talking about something internal that we each should be experiencing. And a university has to enable that. And so to enable that, that means you have to be around people who are going to come at you from both angles. And a single person can come at you from both angles. Doesn't mean they're not heterodox people and orthodox people, but somebody might, on the one hand, love very deeply the things that you love and things you've read. On the other hand, come at you with a set of political beliefs that, are, radically different than your own.
I think that is probably the biggest thing that I have grappled with in my own very self-defined educational journey is what you just described, this desire to surround yourself with people who you're able to grapple with these conversations with, and when you're reading about something or thinking about something, they can challenge you and you can challenge them and you can debate it and you can maybe think that they're totally wrong even though they're making a good argument, but at least you're challenging yourself to, make a case against it and understand why. And I think I've always had a very intuitive sense that that's probably one of the most important things to make sure that I am doing, especially since I'm publicly talking about ideas, which there's a level of responsibility that comes along with that. I better make sure that I relatively know what I am talking about. And I mean, that's part of the incentive for having a podcast too, is it gives me the chance to talk about the things that I'm thinking about with a wide array of people and bring a wide array of people on the show who can, come with very different perspectives and ideas. And I can debate somebody one week who says a college degree is absolutely necessary to be successful. And then the next week I can talk to somebody who says college is dead. Like, go start a business, go get a job. Like, why are you wasting your time? And people, in the middle, and people who are talking about homeschooling is absolutely the way. And then someone else who says, no, homeschooling is going to ruin your child, to which I say, well, are you calling me ruined? Because like we can get real personal with this real fast. But, like the whole array of conversations. But it's something I've been very sensitive about, that it's like, I like it, but I also know that, excuse me, I also know that I need it in order to be as intellectually sharp as I need to be in order to be actually hopefully useful to someone. I'm backtracking a little bit to where we went earlier in the conversation, but there's one more loop that I really want to close just for my own satisfaction before we move on to full on UATX stuff. I'm going to really put you on the spot with this. It is completely okay if you don't have an answer, but if someone they are trying to replicate everything that you just described about the ideal, the Platonic ideal perhaps, of what a university ought to be. They're trying to replicate the intellectual value of going to university, pursuing a bachelor's, or perhaps beyond, but they're not doing it inside of the confines of a university, whether it's because they didn't want to go altogether because they have financial concerns or ideological concerns or practical concerns or whatever about the university system. Or maybe they did go to college like we talked about earlier and they didn't feel like they quite got it. And they're trying to recreate this. They know they want to be a lifelong learner, but they're trying to figure out how. Is it possible to sum up what the core elements ought to be that one is making sure, like, is there a set of actions or a set of principles or a set of, I hesitate to reduce it down to a checklist, but I presume that there are elements that can be quantified. It's like you want to be reading, you want to be getting, contradictory opinions, you want to be discussing, like, and maybe if it's easier, we can put this directly on me. Like if I am, conceited enough to give myself the self-proclaimed responsibility of, I want to be intellectually pursuing things around education in a public-facing way, which means there's some level of responsibility besides just making sure I'm not, sending myself down weird rabbit holes. But like, I want to be a steward of information in a way that's helpful to other people. What are the things I need to make sure I'm doing? I don't know if it's easier to talk about it in the abstract or the specific. Both are fair game. Yeah. But to the level that it can be quantified, is there a simplification of the general way that people should be thinking about doing this to kind of have a benchmark for whether or not they're doing it well or if they're missing something that's like a critical ingredient?
I mean, if what you're asking me is, how do you kind of create or box a university equivalent experience outside of a university or something like that.
Kind of.
Yeah.
We can take it if that's easy. We can take it there if you want.
I guess I'm saying the problem that I have in answering that is I don't even think universities know what you need to be doing at universities. And so it's hard to transfer that. So it's hard to say.
You're jumping to my next question.
Yeah.
This is fantastic.
So I think universities have just become cultures of habit. And, these things called majors just sort of exist there because they've existed for a very long time and people get PhDs in them and then want jobs and teach. I mean, so to me, most universities don't have any sense whatsoever of what they're trying to achieve holistically with their students. And they're actually much worse off than K through 12 education. At least K through 12 has a kind of set, a defined, maybe sometimes nebulous sense of like what young people need to learn and achieve to kind of move on. Universities don't have that. They have lots of checklists. But I'll give you a perfect example. I mean, the utter futility of having something called general education requirements, right? So the idea is like, well, you're at a university, some kind of broad knowledge is important. So we're going to create 12 different categories and you need a class in each of those categories. But it doesn't really matter which class you take as long as it technically meets the category. So you just assembled 12 classes and most of students are taking classes not because they're intellectually drawn to them, but because they don't want to get up before 9 o'clock in the morning and this is what's available or that. So you have this kind of technical requirement that doesn't really add up to any kind of intellectual compound. This is the kind of habitual ineptitude of higher education. They exist. These are products of bureaucracies that come from a system of credentialing that, and that, it's sort of all downstream from a kind of commodification of education. And so again, I'm talking myself out of a job, but this is just true, right? And it doesn't mean if you're at a university, you can't find wonderful professors or have great conversations with peers and discover things or read things or that. But I do think the way universities are set up today, that is more the exception than the rule in most cases. And so when you ask me, like, what do I need to do to have the equivalent of a university education?
Like, maybe don't.
I'm like, let's just kind of shunt to the side the idea of what a university education is and approach it from, what do we need to do to be intellectually responsible human beings?
Mm-hmm.
That's a different question, and so maybe I would answer it. This is going to be a radically unconventional answer.
This is a home for those.
Okay. All right. We're gonna go back to Plato.
Okay.
All right. And I think it's in the Theaetetus. Plato talks about the human soul. He uses, for the image of a human soul, he uses a flying chariot. So there's a chariot flying through the sky, and it's being pulled by two horses, a black horse and a white horse, and there's a charioteer driving the chariot. And it's, sort of making its arc across the sky. And in Plato's formulation, the charioteer is human reason, or rational capacity that's trying to keep its hands on the rein and move things in one direction and keep everything going. The white horse is always trying to pull the chariot heavenward, and it represents what Plato calls thumos, but what we think of as our kind of spiritedness, our drive, our need to be great and to be victorious and to achieve things, and this kind of spiritedness is a great way to put it, and that's trying to drag us up to the sun. And then the black horse represents our kind of appetites, those things that our physical desire, physical nature, things that bring us to earth. And it's always trying to pull us down to earth. Okay. To allow either of those things dominance, is going to pull the chariot either crashing into earth or up into the sun. And so the job of reason is to try and find a way to maintain control over both our thumos and our appetitive nature. I think that's what the point of education is, right? To align our reason with, to come to understand who we are in a thumotic way, like who we are in a kind of rising spiritual way, and who we are as an embodied creature, and then to be able to continue through life's journey in as steady a state as possible, but you're still always going forward. So to me, the things you need to do that, that's what you need to do to be educated.
My friend Taylor Foreman, who's done a bunch of writing for Rebel Educator, and I, we've talked very extensively about, use a different set of metaphors, but the general idea that you just described. We talk a lot about feet in the dirt, head in the stars, as the correct alignment of, at the end of the day, all of the work that we're doing, we're also grappling with this question of what ought an education be, and how do we simplify and summarize that in a way that a parent who doesn't necessarily feel terribly qualified to educate their kid, they have no background in education, they don't know if they can pull this thing off. They're going to try because it seems like it has potential to be a much lesser evil than, and even an overwhelming good compared to the potentially outright evil that is the system that the child is currently being subjected to. But they don't necessarily know what it is that they're doing. And so, a huge part of how I see my job is taking these conversations and this work of all of these amazing people who've thought and researched extensively about what education ought to be, and simplify the sort of core tenets of it. Like here's how to think about the ideals of it, and that feet in the dirt, head in the stars, I think is really important. So I love that that's where you brought this back to.
Yeah, I mean, I apologize if I've been completely unhelpful to parents who are looking for sort of practical things. And so let me try to align it with something maybe a little more practical.
Yeah.
I mean, just think of it simply as, the job of education is to sustain the human soul. And the human soul has three components: the sort of intellectual, rational, the physical, material, and the spiritual. So education should feed all of those components, right? So that there are things that feed our intellect, things that inspire us, that things of beauty, things of creation, that, and then things that help us to strengthen ourselves, physically, and some of that is actually physical. Like kids should exercise, but also kids should come to know who they are and what the consequences of being an embodied being are. Being an embodied being means we have bodies that want things that pull us in moral directions. How do we have a moral matrix? That's the kind of steering of things. It's not just make sure you have a healthy diet and go to the treadmill. It's like, as an embodied being, how do I live in the world in a way that's morally responsible? Our bodies are kind of untamed creatures that need
It's funny how
some direction.
It takes you down the rabbit hole really quickly. It's like you're hungry, but you don't just steal food from over there. Why? Like you get into the depths of morality very quickly.
Right. And that's why all these things are interconnected, right? If any three of those components falters, the chariot crashes. So getting everything aligned, I think, is important. So if you're a parent and thinking about educating a child, I can't give you a checklist of like, this is the math you should be doing, and these are the, the books you should be reading. What I say, like, how are you feeding the mind? How are you helping a student understand what it means to be an embodied creature? And how are you stimulating the spirit? That would be my assessment tool. All right, those three boxes.
I think that's fantastic. So we have to talk about UATX too, University of Austin. You have one of the coolest jobs in the world right now. You are the president of a brand new university, very recently accredited university. Congratulations. I know that's been a long time. Well, actually, it's been a ridiculously short time coming, but it's also been a long time coming in terms of you've been at this for a while. I'm sure it's felt like a long journey. Can you give, I'm pretty sure that a significant portion of the audience is already very familiar with what you're doing at the University of Austin. But if you could just I have a bunch of very specific questions that we'll delve into, but if you can just very briefly summarize for those who have not yet had the pleasure of becoming familiar with this, what it is that you're doing.
Sure. So the University of Austin, we started the project just 2 years ago. So it's been 2 years from launch to literally becoming America's newest university.
Almost exactly 2 years. It was under by 2 weeks or something, right?
I mean, we've been a university now for 2 weeks.
That's amazing.
Now we've been functioning like a university, a kind of, a preparatory state for 2 years. But, we had this idea that sort of the early germ for this idea was early on in 2021. I was in conversation with people who had become, along with me, the kind of founders of the university, including the journalist Barry Weiss, historian Neil Ferguson, Joe Lonsdale, who's a kind of tech innovator and entrepreneur, Arthur Brooks, who used to be president of AEI, now writing books with Oprah, which I think that would be kind of cool to do. I tease him a little. Heather Hying, who's a evolutionary biologist. We had kind of a coming together. I won't go into ways we got there. We all came together in Austin in the spring of 2021 to really talk about higher education. And we each had concerns of varying degrees with the direction that higher education was going. Concerns about the, what seemed to be the kind of growing restrictions on intellectual freedom, concerns about the financial model of higher education seems to be collapsing, about the curriculum, it's been so long since anybody has really thought carefully about whether the curriculum in higher education is serving young people the way it should be serving them. So we had these sort of concerns, and the core question we had was like, okay, if change needs to happen or renewal or rejuvenation or however you characterize it, is it better to do this within existing institutions, find pathways, or do we need to create a new institution? Or do you create a new institution so that you can renew existing institutions? And that was sort of where we landed. We said, well, let's create a university. Now, I was the only member of the group who'd actually run a university. So, I drew the short stick and they're like, okay, you're moving to Austin because we're starting the university here. And I thought, oh, okay, let's.
Yeehaw, gotta get a cowboy hat.
I do now have a cowboy hat. I will say that.
Amazing.
And boots. So that was spring 21, summer 21. I moved here July with nothing in place to start a university. We had a little bit of financial support, not very much. I brought on board early just a few people. We started meeting in a coffee shop and, like the ultimate startup. And
is this going to become like the Hemingway story? There's going to be a cafe someday where it's like, this is where the founding UATX team is. This table right here.
It is. If you want to find it, it's on Bee Cave Road, Trianon Coffee. That's where we would meet. Literally they had like a little extra room that you could sort of reserve. So it was a good place for us to get together and meet early on. And then, in addition to kind of the group of people who was here trying to just start that kind of, let's say the structural part of the university, we'd gathered around us fellow travelers on an advisory board and some, very significant public intellectuals and scholars, people like Jonathan Haidt and Glenn Lowry and, playwright David Mamet and, just really interesting people who were all, ready at least to offer their encouragement and their reputation. So we sort of made a public announcement in November of 2021 that, we're going to build the University of Austin dedicated to the fearless pursuit of truth. And we're going to, wrestle with the challenges that are ongoing in higher education by building a new institution. I'm embarrassed to say this. I'll say it now. I probably shouldn't say this publicly. Really we had the sketch of a university on the back of a napkin at that point. Like we're like, we really meant was now we're going to start this process. But the way it was received in the world was like, that University of Austin, like a meteor, had landed fully formed on the planet. In fact, I think somebody actually used a meteor metaphor, and that there was this thing now, the University of Austin, and let's all have an opinion about it. So we realized that this was a worthy project, and so we had committed to bringing our first freshman class in by fall of 2024. We gave ourselves 3 years to do it. In hindsight, that was like not the smartest commitment to make, because it really should be impossible to start a university that fast. And a lot of people told me that. A lot of my fellow college presidents, like, it's going to take you 10 years to get this started. I'm like, well, we said we're going to do it in 3, so we have to do it in 3. So we made a kind of mad rush. We started bringing more and more people on because people were intrigued by the project. Resources started to come in. We started to raise money. And so we're able to kind of grow pretty rapidly. So that we're, by the end of the first year, we had put together the entire, architecture for a university, which is what you have to do to apply to be a university in a state. So you go to the state and you say, okay, here we are. Here's our plan. 1,800 pages. All right. That was the application. And we go to the state of Texas. And we're like, okay, we're here, review this and determine whether or not we have authorization to be a university. so that, so there, there's a kind of, there's a group called the Texas Higher Education Commissioning Board that reviews these things.
You say this like it's a common occurrence, but you're the first new university in 60 years,
well,
right?
this is what happened.
They
so
have to like dust off. They're like, we don't know how to do this.
That's exactly what happened. They're like, oh no, like really? like what? You guys are starting a university? Like,
no way, crazy.
They're like, how long did it take? They're like, we don't. and so, we realized that there was, the clock's ticking because we had to be approved by fall of 2023 now in order to bring freshmen in 24, because that's the cycle of application. So, so the process began, and while we're, put the application, we're continuing to, raise money and find a location and hire more people and bring in faculty. So we're building the university, even though we're not entirely sure we're going to cross the threshold for authorization. I mean, that's up to this committee. And, to the credit of THECB in the state of Texas, even though this was a daunting prospect to have to authorize a new university because nobody in living memory had done it, they took us very seriously, and we went through a nearly year-long process and committee meetings, site visits, and everything. And, at the end of it, October 26th, they waved a magic wand and we were now a university. And that was just a couple of weeks ago, which meant we can start opening applications, which we did on November 8th last week, which is literally the 2-year date from the first announcement we made. We were able to start applications. And I'd said this publicly the other night, what was really exciting for us, I think probably the most emotional moment I've had in this whole process, was the morning of November 8th. We announced that we were opening applications. We put it on our website, set it up social media. That's all we really did. At 9:30 a.m. in the morning, and at 9:31 a.m., first application was begun. The student jumped on and started applying. And then everything just has continued steadily since then. So we have hundreds of applications already, even within the first week. But that first application coming in, because it was so funny. We're in our offices, the whole team, and it was a big day for us because we had this public launch. And our offices are, we're in these temporary offices. We're renovating this beautiful building in downtown Austin, which will be our campus. But we're still in these offices, and it's sort of like flickering halogen lights and like boxes everywhere and like cubicles. I mean, just like totally Dunder Mifflin. This whole thing. We're all standing around, and our communication team like literally hit the green button to launch and announce, and we're all just like, okay. And then within 30 seconds, we hear pop up from one of the cubicles ahead, our director of admissions, we just received our first application. And there was a cheer, we're like, oh my God, this is happening. This is real. I mean, that for me was the moment that we became a university. As soon as everything else was conceptual, then as soon as a student raises their hand and says, I want to come to your university, you're real.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been deeply excited by what you were doing since I first saw, I guess it was November 8th of 2021. I saw it came at me from multiple angles. This was before I started Rebel Educator, but people knew, like, I was still very interested in education, even though I wasn't doing what I'm doing now. And so people were sending it to me, and I was seeing it across social media. People I knew were involved, and I got deeply excited very quickly, because if this had, if I've said this on Twitter, I think a couple times now as I've shared your stuff, if you guys had launched in the fall of 2014 instead of the fall of 2023, when I was a senior in high school and trying to figure out what I wanted to do, the last decade would have had a very different narrative arc for me, because I absolutely would have been doing everything in my power to be in that founding 100, because what you're doing is exactly the kind of thing that I had this ideal of what I thought university was when I was a kid and I was homeschooling. And in my mind, it was a place, I grew up on a dirt road, middle of nowhere. I had homeschooling friends, but they didn't share the very academic interests that I had. So I was watching all of these lecture series of people talking about, the history of ancient Greece and the history of the Middle Ages and medieval poetry and the great books and all of these. And I was like a kid in a candy store with a great courses catalog. I just wanted to watch everything. But in my head, university would be somewhere full of people just like me, where we could sit around and talk about this stuff all the time. And I could go to lectures and there could be a two-way conversation. So instead of just listening to these people and taking copious notes and then Googling whatever I was curious about, I could actually talk to them.
Yeah.
You know, this is like the classic kid who grows up in the internet era. It's like, wait a second, we could like innovate on this and we could have like in real life interaction. That's crazy. But like in my head, that's what university was going to be. And then I started looking at the schools that were not exorbitantly expensive. And I was like, this is not even close to that. And even the ones that are exorbitantly expensive, a lot of those are not like that. And this, you know, my platonic ideal of what a school was going to be slowly died, or at least got shelved. And I kind of forgot about it and I went on my way. And then the announcement of UATX happened and I was like, this is exactly, you know, a lot of the specifics around the importance of free speech and the like cultural climate. That was not something I was thinking about in 2014 when I was in high school. But the way you're describing what the university is, it's like, I would have written something very similar in terms of the ideals of what I was looking for. So I've been very excited about what you're doing. And it's been very fun to watch it expand this quickly. And it's been an honor to get to be here in Austin seeing what you're doing up close. I definitely do not take that for granted. But I'm also very curious how you alluded to this earlier, thinking about, well, what we're doing as universities, as a system at large is not necessarily even terribly correct in terms of what kids ought to be learning. How are you thinking about the delivering an education experience that, like rethinking what a university, you're starting from scratch. You can build whatever you want. How are you thinking about what a university for the 21st century ought to be? Is the 21st century component even important in how you're thinking about it? Or are there other parameters for like going back to first principles and saying, I think, therefore I am, I have, you know, a university, therefore what follows? Like we have to figure that out.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for your enthusiasm from early days. And now it feels like a great responsibility to live up to the expectations of people who have been excited about this project.
So far, you're doing great.
Thank you.
I have to be honest. Also, I saw, the St. John's College guy is involved in this. Like, this is going to be amazing. That's actually all I needed.
Thank you. So when you frame these things, you're sort of like, okay, what is the purpose? You just have to go right to like the fundamentals. Like, what is the purpose of higher education? And then you start building. That's what's foundational. And, as I said before, I think the reason we have universities is for the pursuit of truth, for the discovery of knowledge, transmission of knowledge, preservation of knowledge. But the moral purpose of a university is to share that knowledge with students. I mean, scholars to share it with each other, but students. And so, we said, okay, what is our North Star? What is our orientation? Like taking that for granted, what's our orientation? And one of our, we have a member of our board of trustees who's joined us after the beginning. He's actually a relatively young fellow, but really, really attuned to like what how students should be served. And he said, our motto should be to students that their excellence is our highest purpose. Okay. So how do you build a university around that? How do you build a university that's committed, whose highest purpose is the excellence of students? And what does excellence mean? Like, what does that mean? What does it mean in the kind of deepest sense? And so, we started to think, okay, what is it how do we prepare our students for flourishing, for the rest of their lives, to set them up? What are the elements of flourishing? And you can't ignore professional preparation because, part of flourishing is professional life, but that's not the whole of it. It's not the end point.
Wait, we don't all just live to work?
We don't all live to work. The highest purpose of university education shouldn't be an entry-level job. And yet in many cases it is.
Mm-hmm.
Or, that's what the certification buys you. So, and so we started thinking about, what are what are the pieces of university education that we want to commit to? And the first thing I've always said that 4 years is too long for undergraduate education. And this is one of those bureaucratic habitual things we have in higher education, that the universities are these things, they're 120 credit delivery systems, and it takes 4 years to do that. I've asked people again and again, why do we have 4-year bachelor's degrees? We have graduate degrees, some are a year, some are 7 years. I mean, it depends upon what you're studying. Shouldn't that matter? And why do we have, nobody has a good answer to this other than it's just what we've always done. And so the accreditors demand that. In Europe, in many places, it's 3 years for a degree. So I began with the assumption like 4 years is too long, but we have to give 4 years. So then I thought, well, we can do a lot with 4 years if we're very purposeful. So, what is it that we want to achieve? The first thing was to offer the kind of comprehensive, we ended up calling the program this intellectual foundation that everybody should have coming out of a university. So what is it about, what do they need to know about the world, about history, about literature, about natural sciences, mathematics, and how do we deliver that in the best way possible? So what we did was we took that kind of futile gen ed model and we said, well, instead of there being random courses in all these different areas, what if we created a purposeful, purpose-driven sequence of courses that runs students together collectively through the great ideas and great human questions and the answers to those questions. And so the questions that we ask about human beings, we're asking questions about the natural world. We're asking about civil society. We're asking about beauty. We're asking about these things. And so oriented around questions, we created the Intellectual Foundations program, which is a 2-year-long program. So for the first 2 years, students are mostly doing the Intellectual Foundations program. And it's a common intellectual journey, which means that every student with their incoming cohort takes the same classes in the same sequence. Why is that important? Because if you and all of your peers are reading the same things at the same time, the classroom isn't limited to the classroom. The entire university, the entire experience is your classroom, because conversations spill everywhere. You're reading Antigone, you're like, whose side are you on in Antigone? And you have that discussion in classroom, and then you have it over lunch, and then you're hanging out in your room, and you have this, what it does is it breaks down the artificial barriers of learning, which are space-based in universities, and it just makes the mind the place of learning. So, so this is, for 2 years, and, this is, you can go very deep and very rich. We have classes like, where do ideas come from, and chaos and civilization. Like, what is civilization? What is chaos? We have, the sublime and the beautiful, ideological movements of the 20th century. Like, where have we gone really, really wrong with, political ideology and all this? And so students are doing that. And that's, the significant component of the first 2 years. I'm like, okay, we still have more time. What else are we going to do? And I said, well, what's most important today? What does the world need most? And we believe that what the world needs most right now are builders, creators, founders, innovators. That, we need to equip young people with the capacity to have agency, to take their passions and to create things of meaning and beauty that are additive to human flourishing. And I don't mean idealistic. I mean, you may end up being somebody who creates a small business, and that's awesome. Or you may, whatever, it might be an app, but creating things. So we decided that we had to, in order to equip students to do that, we had to create a kind of total commitment to it. So we decided every student would do what we call a Polaris project. So the Polaris project begins alongside the Intellectual Foundations program, and it runs all 4 years. And it's this highly structured, curated 4-year project where students begin to conceive early on of like what their moonshot project would be if they could do anything in the world. And then we start to hone and shape that into a project that's actually achievable. And it could be anything as long as it aligns with their passions. So, I've some of the projects that have come up, I've mentioned these before. We had one young woman, it's like, I love languages. All I ever want to do is learn languages. And I'm totally fascinated with languages that have disappeared. And so I'm like, okay, so if you could spend 4 years around that passion, what you do? She's like, I want to create an encyclopedia of lost languages. And I'm like, that is the coolest thing ever. So how do you do that? Like, what do you need? What kind of resources do you need? Who do you need to talk to? What do you need to know? What, are you going to publish this? Is it going to be a database? Is it going to be this? And, by doing that for 4 years, by the end of that 4 years, what that student has achieved is the ability to create something of meaning. And even if she didn't get to the end of it, even if she got halfway through it, the lessons learned along the way are empowering and give agency. So we have, the Polaris project as a kind of core element of what we do. And then in the third and fourth years, the intellectual foundations are year 1 and 2. The third and fourth years focus on what we call our academic centers of inquiry. And so I'm not a fan of college majors. I think the age of the college major is over.
Can you expound on that really quickly?
Oh,
I find that so
sure.
interesting.
Yeah, because college majors are reflective of the interest of academics in their disciplines. They're not in any way oriented towards the interest of students who are at universities or the needs of those students. So, unless you're going to become a scholar or professor, most of the things you learn within a major are, you can learn them for the sake of learning, and you do learn things, but they're actually serving the interest of faculty, not students. And so, what we say is like, what if we took, there are disciplines, there are fields, history and biology, but what if we just sort of thought of these disciplines in a kind of, as a kind of mosaic of fitting them together in different interesting ways? Where would we begin? What would academic departments look like? And so, what we did is, to begin with, we sort of created 3 sort of large containers, which we call academic centers of inquiry. One is economics, politics, and history. The other is arts and letters. And the third is STEM, which is going to have to break into smaller pieces, but we can only do so much at one time. And the idea is to bring into each of these centers of inquiry both traditional scholars and professors and practitioners. So in economics and politics and history, we're not only going to have, professors of economics, we're going to have financiers, we're going to have politicians, we're going to have diplomats. And so bringing the world and the academy together in meaningful ways. And these centers are responsible for producing projects that will be important to others. So what students will do is they'll join one of those centers as a junior fellow and do coursework, but also project-based learning in that, so that the kind of scholarly academic world is fitted in with the world outside the academy. So, again, we have no majors. Everybody gets the same degree. There'll be some sort of indication on a transcript. You did a concentration and something like that, but we want to break down that idea of a major, and we want to break down the silos of what is scholarly versus what is, pragmatic or in the, quote unquote outside world. So our curriculum looks radically different than what you'd experience at another university. There's that foundational intellectual journey that I like to think of as like the genealogy of modernity. Like, how the hell did we get here and who are we? Like going all the way back into like the deep recesses of the human experience. And here we are now. Like, what's the meaning of all this? But then there's also this component of being a builder and innovator, and then a component of bringing together the theoretical and the practical. And so to me, this is a kind of composite form of thinking about the things that one can learn during the 4 years there at a place called a university.
There's so many things that I love about this. I like I hadn't heard you talk about the doing away with majors idea. And this feels very intuitively correct to me, because I've always found it very strange that you go and you specialize in one specific area at the expense of everything else. It's like, I'm going to learn a lot about the Middle East because I find it interesting, and I'm going to miss out on all of the other aspects of history that are also important. Like, of course, you have areas of specialization, you have fascinations, but something about it always felt very incomplete to me. So I very much like this rethinking. I also, you're drawing in multiple models that I am a very big fan of. You're drawing in the classics foundation, but you're also drawing in almost like an apprenticeship
Mhm.
model. It sounds like apprenticeship would be a fair word to describe what kids are doing in these
Yeah.
second years.
I mean, remember, earlier I said that one of the purposes of university education is to be an apprentice um, uh, knowledge creator.
Mm-hmm.
So knowledge, if we think of knowledge as being created only by scholars, that's just half the picture. Knowledge is also created by people who do things outside the world. So that kind of synthesis of those things and then learning from, from the kind of sparks that fly off of that, that's how you'll create apprentice knowledge creators, right?
Mm-hmm. But also, like you are breaking down the barrier between the school and the real world by having them, okay, you're in school, but you're working with people who are,
Yeah.
they're not just professors who are cloistered within the university. They are people who are out in the world doing things, building things, and you are working within the university, but learning how to work beyond it. And you're learning how to think beyond it. And you're learning how to think about, because while you're working in the world, you're also doing these very academic things that people normally think are reserved just for university. But because you're bridging it's less that you're creating a container that you step into and then step out of again. And it sounds more like you're building a bridge.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, we want kids to immerse themselves, students, junior scholars. We want them to immerse themselves in ideas for the sake of ideas and big things. That's what we do for the first 2 years. Like, I think that's really important.
Mm-hmm.
Just become steeped in conversation and dialogue and, human questions and that. Because I think that ultimately, like, absorbing that into one's human system is the gift that never stops giving. But then how do you bridge, right? And that's exactly what it is. So as you sort of move towards what's going to come next, it would be weird if we had that kind of experience and then just some like real world pragmatic internship or something. It's like, how do you phase from one to the next? And that's really what we're trying to do in the latter years. And it'll be different for different kids. Like, some kids are really scholarly. Like, some kids, they're going to just want to hang out and go to archives and read books and learn about Middle East history, and that great, and another kid might be like, that history class was really fascinating. I want to go work for the UN. How do I get a foot in that?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think that's the kind of you have to provide a kind of slate of open-ended opportunities for students if you're really going to serve them.
Is there a type of student that you think is particularly well suited to this learning environment, or are you trying to, because it is radically different from the average university, is it something that you intend to be a fit for a specific type of student, or is it something that you are building with the intention of it being something that could be universally adopted, both at other universities, but also like any student would be a fit here? What types of students are you looking for?
I think it's somewhere between any student and a specific type of student. Like, I think there's a range in there.
Yes.
I think we're going to discover that. So this is part of the reason why we call our first 100 students a Brave 100, because in some ways we're going to learn with them about how this curriculum unfolds for the experience of students, and we're going to ask them to be gracious to us and be like, okay, we may learn things and want to make changes, or you may tell us to do things and that. And so, not that they're guinea pigs, because I feel, we're going to give them a deep education, but I would say they're co-builders with us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in the best possible world, our students are going to teach us what our curriculum should be. And so there's a kind of faith that you have to have that you have created something that's both solid and flexible.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's different than any other experience. I mean, one of the ways when I talk to students, prospective students, one of the things I tell them is like, look, don't just go to a university, come build a university. And so right now we're looking for the student who finds that really, really appealing and intriguing. That's not for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think as we evolve over time and things are more kind of settled into, our own traditions and patterns and legacy, it'll be, that you won't necessarily have to be a pioneer to join University of Austin. You kind of have to be a pioneer the first time around.
Oh yeah. It's like the people who live in Nebraska now. You're not a pioneer, but to be the first there,
Somebody
you
got
had to
there.
be. Yeah, somebody was first. You also talked about thinking about the city of Austin as being like Austin it's not just that it's in the name because it happens to be here. You moved here to start the university.
Yeah.
There's something special about it being in Austin, and I've heard you talk a little bit about Austin, the city of Austin at large being the campus.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think Austin has the kind of dynamism as a city that we want to kind of embody as a university, right? It's a place of unusual conjunctions.
That's why I'm here.
Right. It just is. You've got this sort of like kind of crazy legacy, like, creative, art scene and music and that. And then you have this very stead state government, sort of buttoned up, people. And then you have tech innovators moving in here and starting things and building things, and lots of educational pioneers, which I find fascinating. And you have a really wonderful confluence here of people from different political perspectives, which I really love. I always hear the like, blueberry and the tomato soup thing. I don't buy it. That's not my experience. My experience here is that the people and the ideas really swirl together in interesting ways.
Mm-hmm.
And because they're swirling together here, there's a kind of openness and tolerance here that haven't found in many other places in the country, to be honest.
Yeah, most people aren't one or the other. There's some
No.
weird amalgam of both.
Right. And there is an openness here to hearing one another out or thinking through things together, a kind of tolerance that I think is really admirable. And I mean, that's one of the things we want to embody as an institution. So, so Austin for me was, there really was never any other viable option. Like the kind of university we want to build in the kind of place that Austin is.
Yeah, and I think the fact that you are here and what you are building is also in and of itself poetically representative of everything else that is happening. Even my friend David Perel, who I had on the show a few months ago, wrote an essay at one point. He moved here he's a Californian who lived in New York most of his 20s and then moved to Austin. And people kept asking him why Austin. And he wrote an essay about it. And he was describing the difference between these like different, local or, hubs that attract interesting people throughout the country. And he said, well, people go to New York to get rich. They go to California to get famous, but they go to Austin to be free. And that's like what attracts a lot of the intellectual types that I know here. And I think so much of what you're doing is going to become one of the core exemplars of this, which I'm excited you're here. I think that it is indicative of all the other reasons why I find Austin so exciting and why I'm here too. Pano, we could keep going for a really long time. This has been so much fun. Well, I've had a lot of fun. I don't know how you feel about it, but I've had a great time, and I appreciate you humoring all of my questions. Where would you send people who listen to this interview and want to know more? Obviously, there's the UATX website. Is there anywhere in particular, either your work or UATX stuff, that you would send them to?
Definitely the website, which is uaustin.org. And what you'll find when you go on the website is at the bottom of the homepage, we've collected a tremendous amount of resources, like, things written by people who are connected with the college, things about the university, and that kind of compendium of like UATX 101. And so I think I would probably send people to just scroll down and you'll find all sorts of things that are, that show the kind of intellectual, character of the institution, the people who are involved with it, the things that people have reflected upon when it comes to building this. I think that's the sort of best thing. I would, there's so many brilliant people attached to this project. It's humbling. I mean, it's truly humbling. I mean,
Yeah.
I look at, our list of, the people on our board and advisors and the faculty we've hired. And, I'll tell you this here because I think the announcement will come out before we make before this goes live. If it doesn't, I'm going to get in trouble. But I'll give you an example. So we received a very generous gift from a donor to establish an endowed chair in professorship in politics and censorship.
Mm-hmm.
And we're proud to announce that Michael Schellenberger is joining the faculty of UATX as our professor of politics and censorship.
That's amazing.
Right?
Congratulations.
I mean, the guy at the heart of the Twitter files testifying before Congress, somebody who's literally just prompted the most important Supreme Court case to come up in decades.
Mm-hmm.
He's now on faculty at the University of Boston. These are the kind of people that we have the ability to attract and to host. And it is entirely humbling. I mean, if we can retain that kind of magnetic quality because of the things that we represent and keep bringing these people to the university and to Austin, there's going to be a lot of exciting things happening in the years to come.
I'm so excited to watch it unfold. Thank you so much for taking the time for this. It's been an absolute delight.
Oh, I've enjoyed every minute of it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Pano.
All right, that's a wrap for this week. Thank you so much for being here. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, please leave a 5-star rating. Ratings are how this show gets discovered by other people, and it helps me bring in better guests. And no matter where you're listening, please like and subscribe to the show to make sure you don't miss a future episode. That's all for this week. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you next week.